you want to waste video on this, that's fine.
I didn't know this.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to cross over into Ohio, and they didn't even check the passports at the border this morning, so we're pretty loose at the moment. I-70 was clear, that's always my big fear, and not much construction until I got over this way, and thankfully there wasn't snow and ice. So. And you guys are still in spring. It's a little back off this morning back to Lafayette. It was around 40 over there, so it's still spring over here. So again, I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm just going to share some thoughts with you about using precision ag technologies for agronomic crop management. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you is personal opinion. A lot of it is based on my own experience with the technologies. We don't do research on the technologies itself. We simply use the technologies to do research. And so I'm using them as tools, and much like you're using them as tools. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from, is some of the experiences we've had with them. And then, as I say, just some personal philosophy and a little bit of sermonizing in here too. So I got a lot to talk about, but don't let that stop you from interrupting me with questions if you have them. And I'll be around at least through lunch, and I need to head back sometime after lunch for another commitment later today back home. But a shameless plug for one of my websites. This is the Chat Chew Cafe. It's simply a place where I post links to newsletters from all over the Midwest related mostly to corn and soybean production issues. So I would encourage you to visit that once in a while, and I think you'll find some good timely information, especially during the growing season once the newsletter is really cranked up around the country. So that's just a shameless plug there. You know, we sort of know what precision ag is about, right? And we know that it revolves around GPS. And so everything we're doing revolves around the ability to locate ourselves in the field by GPS and use it to do all sorts of wonderful things. We're not going to talk about equipment control or equipment monitoring aspects of precision ag, but clearly that is a big role or a big evolution, I guess, as it were, of the technologies, that there's now so much out there that we can do with precision ag technologies that in many ways have nothing to do with agronomic management. It just makes our life simpler when we're out in the field. It makes our time a little more efficient maybe with the machinery, but honestly it has little to do with agronomic management. So that's why as an agronomist I'm not going to talk about a lot of these things. I'll leave that to the likes of John Fulton, an ag engineer, to talk about that at some point. But from my perspective as an agronomist, the big thing about precision ag technologies is that it gives us spatial data on our fields, and I got here sort of late, and I was going back and forth among the three rooms, and so everybody this morning was sort of touching on different aspects of different kinds of spatial data today, and so you all are aware of what that's about. And of course it's also about the software to manage that data. And that's where for a lot of us individually that becomes a bottleneck, because there aren't that many software programs that you can buy off the shelf that are intuitive, easy to learn, and honestly flexible enough to do what we want to do, and they're all expensive. And that's the other road, is compared to what we can get with everyday software for next to nothing. A lot of these mapping programs, GIS programs, are pretty darn expensive. And so it just gets problematic on individually, you all dealing with your own data, and so that's why you look to folks like Integrated Ag Services to help you out with that, or whoever else you deal with. But it's a big part of using the technologies is managing the data. And I'm going to focus a fair amount of this presentation on the spatial data aspects. And then this last component of agronomic knowledge, I think, is the component of precision ag technologies that we sort of forget about sometimes. That we have to have the agronomic know-how to take what we're getting on all this spatial data and all the precision technologies. We have to actually apply some common sense agronomics to actually do anything useful with it. And again, I think we sometimes just get ahead of ourselves with all the gadgets and the wizardry and all the fancy tools and technologies, and we sort of forget that you have to have the good agronomic knowledge behind it in order to do something useful with it relative to crop management. So these are the areas that I'm going to focus on with my time with you this morning, and go through a number of these. Well, I guess they all sort of get tied together. So we all know what spatial data is conceptually, right? We've got fields out here that are not uniform. They may have a bunch of different soil types like are illustrated on this slide, and it's not just soil types, but they vary for all sorts of soil characteristics. And you heard, and I forget who was saying what this morning, but you heard talk about the CPUs, crop production units, what do you call them? Crop production units, which are based on, what, half a dozen different things going into that characteristic to describe the variability in the soils. And so fields are variable. These are some of the kinds of spatial data that we can acquire on these fields. And so the usual soil type kind of characteristics and all the grain yields and the moisture that comes along with it. And we're usually getting elevation and all sorts of other things with the yield monitor data. We had some discussion this morning on aerial imagery, and there's also satellite imagery that's available. There's optical reflectance data that we can get off of green seeker sensors, Optrix sensors, and a couple other optical reflectance sensors. For soil testing intensely from a spatial perspective, we're getting that back as spatial data. And if we're running something like a Varus tool that is estimating electrical conductivity or organic matter or pH, depending on what version of the Varus tool you might have access to, that's spatial data. If you're out there with your tablet, if you're out there with your smartphone, walking fields with a crop scouting app and you're drawing boundaries around the wet holes on that app, or you're putting down virtual flags in the field on top of a problem area, that's georeference. That's another form of spatial data. And as we hear more and more about, we have now increasingly the opportunities to actually capture machine data, performance data that we didn't have probably even 5 or 10 years ago. And so that becomes spatial data. And John, where are you at here? Full. You had at our CCA conference that the one slide you had, I believe, on the downforce map, where you were using it to highlight the compaction tracks through the field. You remember that one? I thought that was the coolest slide in the world, where the spatial map of the downforce log from the field, and he was showing these every once in a while. How many feet apart were they, do you reckon? 40. Yeah, 40 feet apart. He was showing this higher, just tiny little strip of downforce. And it was sort of perpendicular or diagonal to the planting direction, and what John told us was that was the tillage passes prior to the planting. But this logged machine data, a downforce log, was able to pick that up. Well, you heard about pinched rows today. You know, again, unless you're out there with an aerial image like Dave was showing you, you can't really pick that up easily. The same with this kind of stuff. But I thought that was the coolest thing as a way to document soil compaction out there. And so again, we're able to acquire so much spatial data. And if you're like me, and if you're actually trying to work with this stuff, you become overwhelmed really quickly with the volume of data that you've got stored on the computer, let alone the time and the energy to actually work with it. So we have a lot of different forms of spatial data. One of the points I want to reinforce with you is that there's sort of two general flavors of spatial data. The first kind is called vector-based. And what that refers to is the kind of data like yield data, which are called point data. And so it's individual points that are logged in the field. It could be line data, which might be if you were physically walking and with your scouting app and drawing the tile lines yourself, that becomes line data. That's a vector kind of data. And then soil survey maps with just polygon shapes. Those are polygon shaped data. Those are vector-based, right? And the other form of spatial data is called raster-based. You might think of it as this is the smooth data. The really pretty looking maps that you put in your notebooks and put up on your shelves to pull out to show your landlord once in a while. And so this can be aerial imagery, it can be satellite imagery, it can be the smooth yield maps that you generate from the yield data, and it can be smooth soil test maps or smooth soil fertility spread maps. And so the difference conceptually between vector data and raster data is, and it's illustrated by these two images here. When you look at vector data like yield data, you have individual points and a lot of blank space in between them. You look at a smooth data set or a raster-based data set, every square inch of that field has data on top of it. Okay? So that's sort of the general difference between these two, but it's sort of a big difference as we deal with certain kinds of spatial data, because when we're working with vector data, especially point data, we're often taking that and trying to use some magic to create a smooth raster-based image from it. And so this spatial vector data can be dense or it can be sparse relative to the land area that it covers. And so a good example of spatially dense data is grain yield data, because we're collecting an awful lot of grain data per acre in the field, and it's not uncommon to be collecting upwards of 300 to 600 data points per acre. More if you have a smaller head on the machine, less if you have a wider head, because if you're harvesting 12 rows versus 6, you're harvesting half as much on a 12. You are accumulating half as many data points on a 12-row head as you are on a 6, because you're simply harvesting that much more ground. But it's still dense. 300 per acre is still dense. Good examples of spatially sparse data points would be, say, any kind of a soil sampling pattern. And let's say for a 2.5 acre grid sample, that results in a spatial density of only 0.4 data point per acre. All right, that's much more sparse than 300 to 600 per acre. Right? And here's the deal with it, is that the non-sampled areas, if you think back to that image I had up here with the point data and all the field you can see in between, all of that space in between these data points represents areas that have no data. And they're simply unknown. And that has an impact, because the software then, to generate that pretty smooth map that you're going to show the landlord, it has to take those data points that it has, the data from it, and then it has to basically interpolate or guess what's in between all the rest of it. And so it does that mathematically. There's some fancy algorithms that I don't pretend to even begin to understand. It's sort of like turning on a light switch. I just hope it works and that it's accurate, but it's not always accurate, and that's sort of the rub. And so data sets that are more dense cover more of the land. They simply have fewer holes of unknown space in that field. And therefore, the software has to do less interpolation, and therefore the resulting smooth map is intuitively more believable, because it's been based on much more data. And so the spatial data density affects how accurate that fancy color smooth map is, in terms of, actually in terms of the spatial patterns. Okay? The data themselves are accurate. You know, if you're doing 2.5 acre soil samples, and assuming you've pulled them well, the data itself in the lab is accurate for that point. But when you take a 2.5 acre grid, or really any kind of a standard kind of soil sample pattern, and then interpolate to a rasterized spatial map, the question is the map accurate, the spatial map? And spatial density, because it affects the accuracy of the interpolated maps, it potentially affects the accuracy of the management decisions that you will make based on that fancy, smooth map. And because it might affect the decisions you make and the accuracy of them, it potentially influences the yield of dollar consequences of those decisions you make. So it's sort of an important deal here to understand the challenges of working with sparse spatial data. And so when you look at a yield map, this is a 47 acre field. It's a 12-row head. Harvest speed was roughly 3.5 miles per hour. That is a spatially dense data set. There's a lot of data points in that field. And every 2 seconds and a lot of yield monitors today are collecting every 2 seconds. And that's what it's recording. And so data collected every 2 seconds at a harvest speed of 3.5 miles per hour. It's recording about 1 data point for every 10 foot of linear travel down that harvest pass. And that equals about 145 data points per acre with a 12-row head. All right? When you take that data and tell the software to interpolate it to a real pretty spatially smooth map, you might do it as small grids like this. And so now you've got all of that 47 acres has a data point associated with it, has data associated with it. And so it may look like that, or you may choose to do a contour map. And so there's another version of interpolating that data from that 47 acre field. And they're nice and they're pretty, and it looks really cool when you print them off on a color printer. But in all honesty, when you look at smooth maps, there's not a whale of a lot of differences in the visual appearance of it. In fact, I sort of prefer the raw yield data myself because the resolution's a little bit better, frankly, and I can pick out some of the weird things a little bit easier versus looking at the smooth maps, right? So my point with this is that with really dense spatial data, you really don't even need to interpolate it. You really don't need to create the smooth rasterized map. It's pretty good on its own. And so for the data that we work with that are this dense, you can actually just use the raw data visually, if that's your purpose, is to evaluate it visually. Now, I want to compare that to soil sampling, and I'm not here to promote Dave's fancy soil sampling. Okay? That's not why I'm over here. He just knew I have this same message, and that's one of the reasons he brought me over. But I want to show you the potential inaccuracies of some of the soil sampling patterns that we do. And again, a common soil sampling density would be a 2.5 acre grid. And so a single sample might consist of somewhere between 8 and 12 soil cores, say pulled within a 40-foot circle of a mule or a gator or whatever strategy that you're using to go through it. And so on a 25 acre field, that a 2.5 acre grid would give you about 12 data points. And on this image, I'm showing you the 12 data points and the size of these individual data points. I've just drawn to be 40 feet, right? Reflecting the 40-foot circle that we generally pull our cores with. And I do that just to make you realize or reinforce the fact that those 12 data points are not occupying a whole lot of square footage on that field. And everything in between those 12 data points represents spatial holes. There's no data in between these 12 data points. And that means the GIS program has to figure out what's the pattern between these 12 data points based only on the data from the 12 data points. All right? So I can illustrate an example of the potential inaccuracies by using an organic matter example. And I do this with a certain amount of almost trepidation, but I think it works. I think it's valid. Because some years ago we had the opportunity to get some satellite imagery from NASA on some fields over at our eastern Indiana Purdue farm. And it was bare soil imagery. In fact, we went to the trouble of moldboard plowing 120 acres just so we could fly this silly satellite over and get bare soil imagery. And we've regretted that decision for 20 years since. But my colleagues who were really into satellite imagery at the time, this is something they really wanted to do. But it's given me a good example to work with because if you look at the infrared wavelength band of that satellite image on bare soil, it does a pretty good job of identifying the dark and light soils, and then I make a leap of faith that I can correlate the dark and light soils with organic matter. Okay? And so that gives me, in essence, an organic matter map of the entire field, a fully rasterized map of the entire field, and so it sort of gives me one look at the possible true spatial variability of organic matter in the field, right? So I've got, because there's nothing else on a soil test that we can ever come up with a true representation of the spatial variability because we just can't measure it that well. But with satellite imagery and bare soil and light and dark and correlating it to organic matter, we can come up with an approximation of truth. And then we did some soil samples, both on a 2.5 acre grid and a 1.5 acre grid in those fields. And then we took the soil test values for organic matter, and remember on a 2.5 acre grid there's 12, and on a 1.5 acre grid there'd be 5 times as many. We took those soil test values, ran them through the software to interpolate a smooth rasterized organic matter map of the spatial variability, and then we asked ourselves, how close can we get to the satellite imagery? This is the satellite imagery. All right, I've colorized it in brown to sort of highlight the darker soils and the lighter soils. This is a Blount-Powama landscape in eastern Indiana, and I know some of it comes into western Ohio. You might be familiar with those associations. The Powamo silty clay loams are the lower lying swales in the landscape. They're the higher organic matter soils. The Blount silt loams are the higher parts of the landscape. They're lighter colored soils. And it's just a classic soil association in eastern Indiana. The boundaries around that you see on the image, those are the official NRCS soil boundaries, and of course we all know how inaccurate Those can be depending on the field, depending on the county, but nevertheless, the NRCS soil type boundaries laid over top of the satellite image actually do a pretty good job of picking out these two major soil types in this landscape. So again, this satellite image is my sort of surrogate for truth. And I'm saying I think that is a good representation of the true organic matter spatial variability in the field. And then my question is, with my 2.5 acre, 2.5 acre pattern, where I'm getting 12 data points, now I'm asking, can I reproduce this organic matter map by using only the soil test data? So that's what I'm going to show you next, I believe. So that is the interpolated map using the 12 data points and the organic matter values from the 12 data points and interpolating it into a smooth spatial variability map for organic matter. And I would dare say that it is not a good approximation, a good relationship to the satellite image, right? You've got high organic matter here on the east, and it sort of ties in, with here. But again, there's a sample data point that landed there, and up here there's a sample data point there, and it's sort of picked up light color there, but it didn't get all these little niceties of where the Powamo sort of creeps up into that swale. And again, it's just not a good map. It's not very accurate, all right? Well, well, okay, I got ahead of myself. So let's look at a half-acre sample taken from the same field, and that would be the data points where we pulled those. And now we tell the computer to draw the organic matter map. Look how much better it is. It's not perfect, right? It's not perfect. But look how much better, how much closer it gets to the satellite image of soil color. And what I'm saying is, it represents these two soils. You can pick out the Powamo, you can pick out the Blount silt loam. All right. This is the only example I can come up with on soil testing to show how potentially different the maps can be, the spatial maps, based on the intensity of sampling in the field. If you accept the fact that this is valid and that it's a good example, well then you immediately have to start asking yourselves the questions, what does that mean for all the other soil test nutrients and soil pH when we're doing these kinds of samples? So this is the soil test phosphorus rasterized smooth map drawn from the soil test values on the 2.5 acre grid. And I've colored it in the way that we normally describe results. And so the red represents soil test. The gray represents the soil test values from 15 to 30 parts per million, and that would be what we would call the maintenance plateau, where you're only replacing what the crop takes off. And the blue would represent areas in excess of 30 parts per million. And so your fertilizer rates would be starting to come down, and at some point they would come down to zero, right? So this would be, in essence, they become spread maps. So this is what the 2.5 acre did for us. And look at the difference on the 1.5 acre. And again, this is the spatial variability map for the phosphorus, which will almost immediately turn around to a spread map that looks somewhat similar. And I'm just asking, which map do you want to run with? All right. And I think I'm going to run with the one on the right. Now, I can't prove that to you like I can with that example on organic matter. But I know intuitively that if I pull 5 times more data points on a field to draw the spatial map, I'm a little more confident on its accuracy because there's 5 times more data. This has major ramifications for us if we really want to use VRT well and accurate. And so the lesson from this, to always remember about spatial data and software, is that the software will do exactly what you tell it to do. You tell it to create a smooth map, it will create a smooth map. It doesn't mean that the results are accurate. And so the software can be the best software in the world, but if the data you give it are pretty sparse, there's no guarantee that the resulting map is accurate. And I just think we tend to forget that. And of course, if the spatial maps are questionable accuracy, well then, even if you've got the best agronomists in the world standing in the back of the room, they're working with an inaccurate map, and so the results are questionable also. And this is one of the biggest challenges we face with spatial data and making agronomic decisions. So here's the spread maps that I was talking about. That's the spread map. And red is no phosphorus recommendation. Yellow is drawdown rates. Green would be just crop removal at roughly 60 pounds per acre. And blue would be crop removal plus buildup. Right? So that's the spread map on a 2.5 acre. There's the spread map for a 1.5 acre. And again, major differences on how that spatial variability works. And you put the two together again. The left side are the Bray P1 map and the spread map based on 2.5 acre. The right side is the 1.5 acre. Major differences on how the appearance of that interpolated map look, and therefore the appearance, or probably the results of what we're going to get from it. So the question is, can we afford to sample as intensely as 1.5 acre? Anyone here have the guts to do that? Maybe I should. Anyone here have the bankroll to do that? I mean, not many people are much of a mind to do that. I would argue, without being able to prove it at all, I would argue that all of us could justify a one-time, half acre, 1 acre, whatever you guys come up with your fancy rate. I think we could justify a one-time, really intense, spatially intense soil sampling so that we get a good baseline from the get-go. And then who knows, maybe we never do it again. If that first one identifies the problem areas accurately, then we focus on those in the future, maybe sample only randos and whatnot. And so maybe we never have to invest that intensely again. I'm not sure. So I think the question is really, can we afford not to? Because of the potentially wrong conclusions or wrong spread maps that we create from it. Now, and I'm not going to get into the fancier rig that you have, the automated rig that you have for doing the really intense stuff, but I'm saying as one alternative, we could take, say, a standard 2.5 acre pattern, and we could just supplement it with some number of additional samples that are targeted at specific areas of the field. And so we use something like our yield map from previous years, maybe an aerial image that also highlights strange areas in the field. And we take the 2.5 pattern, which are the circles on this slide, and maybe we supplement it with some number of additional ones that are, in the case of using a yield map as your source, you may target some additional ones that are specifically hitting some of the low yielding areas in the field that maybe you'd miss with a 2.5 acre sample, but also making sure that you target some of the unusually high yielding areas. Why would you want to make sure you make sure that you draw soil samples from unusually high yielding areas? Because that sort of doesn't make sense. We're trying to identify the causes of low yield so that we can fix them. Why would we want to make sure we also sample unusually high yielding areas in the field? Why? Well, okay, it's a big picture thing, but why should I not sample only the low yielding spots, but make sure I also sample a few of the high yielding spots? If you
and the differential.
Okay, you're too academic for it. All right, the common. I mean, think about it. It is not unlikely that when you get a good spatial map of a field for, let's say, phosphorus, it's not unlikely that the lower phosphorus level areas of the field may actually be the highest yielding areas because it's been withdrawing more phosphorus year after year after year. And in fact, your higher yielding phosphorus areas may be your lowest yielding because you haven't been removing phosphorus. See, this could go either way when you're identifying low P or high P or low K and high K. It could go either way. So that's why I think it's important to also make sure we sample a few of the really high yielding areas to make sure that it's not coming down too greatly because those may be the areas that we actually want to put more on. Or it might be in this field that the red areas may in fact be low because they're low P. We won't know until we sample them, right? Just to sort of move on, the potential of precision ag crosses many boundaries. There's the potential for greater equipment efficiency, greater use of crop inputs, more efficiency on your labor perspective, reduction in operator fatigue, and I think AutoSteer, the best thing it ever did was reduce operator fatigue. But also the ability to document spatial variability, and then identify the yield limiting factors causing the variability, and then hopefully managing those. And And so, the key to managing spatial variability in our fields is all about diagnosing why the spatial variability is there. So it comes down to identifying the causes of spatial variability. And if we fail to take the steps to identify why we have the spatial variability in yield, let's say, then the management decisions we make can easily miss the mark. And we're just throwing darts and just hoping that whatever we do with variable rate or anything else is going to work if we really don't know why we have the spatial variability. So this is where sort of the common sense boots on the ground comes into play, is that there's still a need to be out there scouting fields, walking fields, doing crop diagnostics. So, I'll just say we got to be careful if we don't do a good job of identifying why we have the spatial variability, because it's tempting to say, well, we got these low yielding areas that are historically low, and I'm not going to waste any more fertilizer or mulch because I'm not getting much return for it. Well, we got to be careful, because it's like that example I had before. They may be low yielding because they're actually deficient. And so in fact, those areas may need more fertilizer than the high yielding areas. Or it could be the other way around. And you won't know unless you're sampling and doing these correlations with it. One of the talks this morning talked about positioning hybrids, and I have a real mental block on multi-hybrid positioning, and that I think your data actually reinforced, I think, if I was looking at your results also. And I think we got to be careful with sort of these willy-nilly management decisions to, say, position a defensive hybrid in those low-yielding areas. And the willy-nilly part of that is that if we don't know why they're low-yielding, we may not be able to choose the hybrid with the right set of hybrid characteristics to address the reason that it's low. Are you with me? And so I don't like these terms, defensive or offensive. They mean nothing to me. They're only defensive if I know why they're defensive, what they're defending against, and then if I have done a good job of walking my fields and diagnosing the causes of the low yielding areas, and if then there are hybrid characteristics that will meet those, you bet I'll put different hybrids in the field. But I am not gonna throw darts and just put a so-called offensive and a so-called defensive hybrid in the field if I don't know why they're offensive or why they're defensive. And I think if I read some of those slides correctly this morning from the back of the room on whoever was doing that, you had one example where I believe the defensive was the highest yielding across all 9 CPUs. I remember right? Well, what that told me was that defensive hybrid was simply a good yielding hybrid, period. And I don't know why it was called defensive. It was simply a relative to the offensive one in that comparison. It was simply the better hybrid, period. And then you had one where I think maybe the offensive one, most of the time, even in the challenging CPUs, well, there again, that sort of told me, it really tells me from a distance that that offensive hybrid was simply the better hybrid. And so, as an agronomist, what I think is more important is to identify hybrids that do pretty darn good most of the time, regardless of the situation. You can call them workhorse if you want. I don't like that term either. But I want hybrids that yield well and yield well consistently, because I cannot predict the yield limiting factors next year. If I knew it was going to be a drought, then I may go heavy on drought tolerant hybrids. But then they may be good hybrids on their own. And if there was such a thing as a wet feed hybrid, I would want to go that way if I knew it was going to be a boost rounder monsoon season like we just went through. But I don't know what next year's going to be, so I just want a hybrid that tells me, by virtue of how it has performed in variety trials, that it does pretty darn good most of the time. So I don't get real excited about multi-hybrid positioning, and that might be just my mental block that I have. Well, how do we go about identifying these yield limiting factors? It's spatial variability, and managing it is all about finding the problem, finding the spatial variability, finding the problems, and then identifying the yield limiting factors that are making them happen. Well, here's where I say you just got to get your butt out in the field. And you got to spend time actually in the field. You can't just sit at your desk and look at these aerial images. You can't just sit at your desk and look at yield map data. Someone has got to get out there and start identifying why are these problem areas problem areas. We have a lot of help out there. You've got these folks here, you got extension, you got independent crop consultants, you got all sorts of help out there to help you do it. And we have all sorts of resources out there that help us do the crop diagnostic. And we have our field guides at Purdue. Ohio State has some field guides. There's all sorts of resources out there to use to help us do it. So we have a lot of resources. but it still requires somebody getting out there and spending some time. We have a lot of mobile GPS platforms out there, don't we? We've got iPads, we've got other tablets, we've got smartphones. Most of these you can get scouting apps, mapping apps. They all have some form of note-taking app already built into them. We take pictures with these things and they're geotagged to the spot that you took the picture. So that becomes another part of your geodata that you can bring in to your software. And there's nothing magic about these mobile GPS platforms for doing crop scouting. It just allows us to be a little more efficient in the field, collecting data, mapping data, and storing it, and then bringing it back into our desktop later on. It just makes it a little more efficient. In and of themselves, it doesn't really, it isn't a silver bullet. We have a lot of yield monitor data, some of us for maybe upwards of 20 years. And so certainly, one of the simpler uses of yield monitor data is to simply allow us to visualize the problem areas. And then maybe we draw little boundaries around them with our mapping software, import that into our mobile platforms, so that we can walk directly to those areas this fall, next spring, whenever, to do our targeted soil sampling, to do all of our other investigative work to try and diagnose, but it makes our scouting a little more efficient because we're going directly to a particular problem area, not just sort of randomly going through the field. And in the same way, Dave talked a little bit about aerial imagery this morning. One of the simplest uses of aerial imagery is the same thing. It helps us identify problem areas, and it helps us identify those areas before we get to harvest. And you know how hard it is to, when you're out riding the combine and going through the low yielding patch, and you say, oh, I wonder what caused that. And so you call up Dave, you call up your local extension guy, and say, hey, my yield just dropped 50 bushel. Why do you suppose that is? I don't know what Dave tells you, but I say I don't have a clue. It's not the right time of year to be calling me. All right, the right time of the year is when the thing starts happening, and that's one of the neat things aerial imagery can do for us, is to spot. These are soybeans over, actually it's in one of these same fields over in eastern Indiana. These are soybeans a couple years ago, middle of July. And this is just a simple infrared. And so the darker red is more vegetation or healthier vegetation. The lighter red is less vegetation or none. And so we know there's a lot of variability in our fields. And if we can identify that the spatial variability is developing early, among other things, it allows us to get our butts out there earlier, to walk the field and do a better job of diagnosing the causes, because the earlier you can be out there diagnosing, the evidence is still fresh, the symptomology is still clean, other signs may still be there. It simply allows us to be more efficient and more accurate on diagnosing the causes, and that's what we have to do to manage spatial variability in most cases. And in some cases, by being able to do this earlier, it might allow us to actually do something about them yet that year. Okay, it might be fungicide applications, it might be insecticide applications, or whatever. We might be able to do something yet that season to try and preserve some of that yield. And of course, aerial imagery or crop sensor data supplement yield maps for doing this business of identifying and documenting the variability. But understand that yield data, aerial imagery, crop sensor data, none of this actually diagnoses the cause of the problem. And I've been in a lot of meetings where folks talk about aerial imagery or crop sensor data or whatever, and they'll stand up here and they'll say, well, this area right here that's got very little red in it, that's a wet hole. And the way they say it implies that the image told me it was a wet hole, and it doesn't. My experience in this field for 20 years tells me that most of the low vegetation areas is wetness, not the aerial imagery. All right, so just be aware of that you still got to get boots in the ground to actually validate what is going on. We're using this kind of data to simply make it more efficient going out and walking that field. So let me give you a few opinions on variable rate crop inputs. We know the intuitive reason behind variable rate anything, right? We got spatial variability in the field. And so we believe that spatially different areas of a field may in fact need different levels of some input to optimize yield or to optimize the dollar return, right? It makes perfect sense, because that's what spatial variability is all about. So we understand the intuitive nature of that. But let me just say, we talk a lot about management zones, but understand that management zones are likely to be specific to the inputs you're considering. Meaning that the management zone for a population, the spatial nature of that may not be the same as the as the management zone for nitrogen fertilizer, which may not be the same as the management zone for P&K, which may not be the same as a management zone for something else. We're probably looking at individual management zone patterns. And I really doubt that there's one management zone spatial pattern that's going to work for everything. So that's part of the challenge, is where I'm headed with that. I guess that's what I say there. There's a lot of different things we can use. These folks are developing their CPUs based on half a dozen or so variables, and some of them are probably on here, right? But we have soil survey maps, we have historical yields, we have electrical conductivity estimates from something like the Varus tool, we've got elevation data, everything that comes from the soil sample data, we've got soil water holding capacity. There's a number of sources or people out here, organizations I guess, that are coming up with fancier digitally mapped soil characteristics or some combination of all the above. We have a lot of different factors to use. And actually I'd like to learn more about your CPUs at some later date because I'm just curious about that. But there's no single accepted best way to come up with these management zones is what I'm saying. And that's probably because they're going to be specific to specific inputs. All right? And it makes it a bit of a challenge. And the other thing about spatial variability is, it's sort of ironic in a way. In order to manage spatial variability, the spatial variability has to be uniform, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron. But what I'm saying is that these zones can be spatially variable on the landscape, but I sort of want the pattern of it to be the same year after year. In other words, temporally stable. And if they're not consistent year to year, the patterns that is, it really makes it tough to manage. So you think about something like spatial variability map for soil pH. That is a temporally stable pattern, isn't it? Those low pH areas are going to remain low pH until you do something about it. They're not going to jump up and move to some other place in the field. But yield in particular is notoriously a good example of a spatial variability pattern that sort of jumps all over the place one year to another, right? And one crop to another in many cases. And so I want to show you this one example. This is from another one of our fields over in eastern Indiana, Purdue Farm. These are 4 consecutive years of corn yield. It's a continuous cornfield. And what I've done, and this is, and I should have thrown in the other example that really reinforces it. We have to be careful how we color the maps on our software when we look at them. And we have to be careful not to let the software automatically assign the colors. Because in this case, what I've done is I've taken the 4 years of data and I've used the exact same color legend, meaning that the red is the same yield level, the yellow is the same yield level, it doesn't matter which of the 4 years. So it's sort of on equal footing. And again, I kicked myself for taking out one slide I had done the other way. But looked at this way, there are 2 years. It'd be 2010, 11, 12, 13. And so 2010 and 12, if you look at those left 2 years, there's some reasonable uniformity of the patterns one year to another. Reasonable, not perfect. And if you look at 2011 and 13, well, they certainly do not look like 2012 and 13, do they? And the reason I'm bringing this up is we've got to be careful if we let the software do the coloring. We would actually get very similar looking patterns visually, meaning that this area that's low yielding relative to this year, well, you can sort of pick it out there. There's sort of the lower yields, right? And it's really red the 1 year, and it's sort of lighter green there. Some of it sort of shows up, but it was a much better overall year. And so it might be below average, but it's darn good corn. Well, so see, I asked this question that if I'm going to treat the below average areas differently, it sort of depends on the year because and then look at 2013. There's nowhere near the same patterns in 2013. So if I had used these 2 years to come up with some management zone, I may have totally blown that decision in a good year. So again, this is another mental block I have when I think about historical yield zones and how careful we have to be about using, say, multiple years of yield data to come up with zones, you just gotta be a little careful doing it, is all I'm saying, and especially mixing and matching crops. Putting corn and soybean yields together over many years to come up with a map, a zone map. We gotta be really careful with that. And so I'll just leave it at that. Now, variable rate fertilizer and lime have tended to be cost effective and well accepted. And that's partly because their application rates are correlated with spatial variability for soil test values. And what that means is that the recommendations we give for a variable rate prescription are based on spatially stable single factors. When I come up with a spatial map for broadcasting phosphorus, it's based on one factor and one factor only. Well, soil test, I hem them all because if you're in the maintenance range, you got a proper rule in there too based on the previous yield history. That's why it's worked. Assuming that the soil test was accurate. Now, variable rate nitrogen or seeding rates tend to be more challenging because they're influenced by more than one factor. And so it's not as easy to come up with that prescription because it's not just one factor like a soil test, it's many factors. And for both of them, it's soil characteristics, it's rainfall timing, rainfall amount, rainfall duration, and maybe genetics. And for nitrogen in particular, it's also influenced by how much soil nitrogen is there in the soil. What's the source of nitrogen, the timing of your application, the placement of the nitrogen, whether you got cover crops or not, how much rain and everything else. It's much more challenging to come up with a variable rate for these two particular inputs. And so consequently, it's a little hard to come up with management zones for nitrogen or seed that are actually going to be stable one year to another. In hindsight, we could probably always go back and say, well, we should have done this here, and we should have done that there. But to look ahead with these two inputs is much more challenging. Now, my general opinions on nitrogen is that we need to be cautious developing variable rate nitrogen prescriptions on single factors like organic matter, which is commonly done, based only on organic matter. It might be better than not doing anything, but it's not that simple to predict the soil nitrogen supply based only on organic matter because there's all sorts of nitrogen loss mechanisms that are involved with that too. And, you know, there are at least 3 or 4 organizations now that are offering computer models to predict the available soil nitrogen and then consequently how much nitrogen fertilizer we should put on. And I would just simply say, understand that this nitrogen cycle is an extremely complex biological system. And it's notoriously influenced by Mother Nature. And so predicting that soil nitrogen supply is really difficult. And just, I think at this point I would use any kind of computer model like that as another tool in the toolbox to help me make my own decision. But I don't know that I'd be relying 100% on some of the computer models that are out there at this point in time. Jim Camerado, our soil fertility specialist, and myself, we've done a lot of nitrogen research in Indiana over the past 8 or 9 years. I think it's reasonably applicable to western Ohio. I'm not sure this far into Ohio, but say in the first county or 2 of Ohio. And so I would encourage you to maybe look up this summary of our nitrogen work. You can find it at the Chat 2 Cafe. And I think, again, at least on the western tier or maybe 2 tiers of counties, our recommendations may be applicable. With respect to population, it's also influenced by a lot of factors, mostly any that are related to stress on the crop. And in particular, if there is a single factor that you could base a prescription on reliably, it's probably an estimate of available soil moisture during the season, meaning are drought prone or not. Okay? We've done a lot of work on populations around the state, and I can divide 80-some trials or 60-some trials into 2 broad groups of responses. And it's based on basically drought stress. We've got a range. The blue line is the yield response to population for 50-some trials that I simply call my normal range of growing conditions. Some superb, some average, some a bit stressful. But they all seem to top out at an agronomic optimum of about 32,000 final. And then we've got about a dozen trials that have been severe drought stressed. And of course they top out much lower because, you know, that makes sense, right? But it looks to us like there's maybe 2 broad categories of yield responses. And other than differences in our trials, and these are all field scale trials, so these are 30 acre, 50 acre, 100 acre, 200 acre trials. Other than differences in the field due to variable soil moisture, we've seen very few other instances of different yield responses to other kinds of management zone characteristics like soil types or elevation or even hybrids, okay? It's been primarily available soil moisture. Seems to be the driver. And we've also not seen a very consistent relationship between the overall yield level of the field, productivity if you will, and the optimal plant population for that field. And it appears that this average optimum population in the low 30s is pretty suitable for a pretty wide range of productivity. And I'll show you two graphs. This is a made-up graph that simply says if there was a relationship between optimum population and yield level, it would look something like this. At low yield levels, you'd have a population, and then as the yield level increases, the optimum population would increase. This is what it would look like. This is what it actually looks like on all of our trials around the state. And what you're looking at is, let's say, from about 150 bushel on the left to about 240 on the right. These are the optimal populations for each of these trials within that yield range. And what we're saying is there's a very weak relationship between optimal population and yield in that range, meaning the low 30s works for anything within that range. They're all sort of fluttering around this low 30s, all right? And so even out here at 240 bushel, we have some optimum populations that are down in the low 20s, right? It's sort of a flutter, it's a range in there. And so this is what sort of, again, reinforces to me that I'm not sure for a lot of what we farm, I'm not sure there is a real need for variable rate seeding. I think there's probably no more than 2 seeding rates necessary for any given field, a lower rate for highly stressed soils or zones in the field, and primarily drought-prone areas. And those are probably seeding rates around the mid-20s. And then, frankly, for everything else, it's probably one seeding rate up around 34,000 to end up in the low 30s. Okay, that's my opinion. You can take it or leave it. I really don't care. But this is what my data are telling me. We've got this summary online too. You can find it at the Chat and Chew that goes into a little bit more detail on what we've seen with yield response and population. And I'll just finish with this, that I love this technology. I'm as geeky and nerdy about it as anybody. It's done wonders for our ability to do on-farm field scale trials and simplify the logistics for everybody involved. And we can gather more data today in research than we could 20 years ago. I said the coolest thing since sliced bread. But we have to be careful that we use it wisely and that we don't put that technology ahead of the agronomic knowledge to really make sure we're doing the right things. And a lot of opportunities with this, but it just needs to be done thoughtfully and wisely. And with that, I think that's it. So hopefully I didn't take too much time there, Dave, and I'll be around. I don't know if we have time now, but if not, I'll be around. You got a question or two from anybody? Right behind you, Dave. Yes, sir. The question is, what do we think we're measuring with soil conductivity like you get from a Bears tube? We know that we are estimating conductivity.